You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another day, another week, another episode. The grind never stops. We're ready to go. It's a fun day. It's a Thursday. It's the day before Friday. You can't go wrong with that. We're here to have some fun. So we're going to jump into this. We've got a lot to talk about. It is what it is. It's always what it is. So today we're going to do a little talking about Texas Tech again and how they're fighting against the world and how that may impact Utah. We're not going to spend too much time there. I don't want to keep dragging this on. We'll look at some official visitors that are coming in this weekend, and then we'll continue the scheduling series with Utah's next opponent, which will be Cincinnati, which just so happens to be Brendan Sorsby's last team. So kudos to everybody out there for the timing on that one. Yay for us. All right, before we do that, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Feeling confident about your finances changes everything, and that's where Canyon View Credit Union comes in. They focus on helping you build something strong over time and at your pace, and in a way that fits your life. With Canyon View Credit Union, it's not about a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about steady progress, real guidance, and having someone in your corner who's there for the long run. Through every step, every goal, every chapter, Canyon View Credit Union is right there with you. And honestly, that kind of support just feels different. Learn more about how Canyon View Credit Union can help you build your own momentum at canyonviewcu.com. Canyon View Credit Union, shaping your financial journey. All right, let's jump into this. We got a lot of fun with this one. We're just going to go right to it. We're going to get into the Brendan Sorsby stuff again. There's not a ton that has changed, but it's more the impact of what has taken place. The tone deafness of Texas Tech in believing that they have done nothing wrong. Yesterday, Kirby Holcutt, the athletic director at Texas Tech, released this statement. If you're on YouTube, you can see it here. It's a massive statement. I've retweeted it on my Twitter account, so you can go look at that. But essentially, it's a lot of it's word soup for essentially saying that, Brendan Sorsby has an addiction. It's a serious thing, and we need to lend our support to him. The problem there is support doesn't mean that he has to play. Right? You can still bring him in with the program. You can still have him participate in terms of whatever that may be. But the reality is he violated one of the biggest, quote unquote, sins of sports. And, Texas Tech continues to double down on this, saying they were not a party to this. This all took place prior. But at the same time, they don't recognize that they're the ones continually pushing the narrative that he needs to play, that somehow that is the only way that he can get over this addiction. And look, I don't want to take any addictions lightly, but at the same time, trying to allow him to play and commit the biggest no in sports is just not a thing. And yes, the injunction has come about, which allows him to do that, but there's massive blowback amongst everybody in the world. There's not really, it's literally Texas Tech against the world. And that I'm not being, cute there. This is literally the thing. There's very few, if any, people that I've seen out there outside of the Texas Tech world that see this as being, a matter that shouldn't even be, this shouldn't even be a matter, because Texas Tech should just do what they need to and just not allow him to play. But here we are, and we'll see what happens. So as this relates, the Big 12 today is Thursday. They are meeting as an executive committee, which is Brett Yormark and, the Big 12 leadership there, with three presidents of the conference. And those presidents right now in the executive committee are Kansas State, and BYU. So those three presidents are going to be involved in kind of the initial conversation of that, with a full meeting next week. That's the plan. So you're not going to hear anything in terms of what the Big 12 is going to do, if anything, against Texas Tech. If something were to come about and they do take a vote on saying, hey, we're not going to play you unless you kick off Brendan Sorsby, whatever that may be, they have to have 12 of 15 votes. Obviously not 16, because Texas Tech isn't going to be involved in that decision. This will just come down to the remaining 15. As part of this, there is a bylaw specifically in there that if a member institution creates harm to the larger body of the Big 12, the membership of that, they have a right to be able to do what they need to. So that's one of the bylaws that they can utilize to be able to allow them to either one, not play them or sanction them or whatever that may be, to be able to kind of force Texas Tech's hand. Now, Texas Tech is not going down without a fight. Their athletic director obviously put out his statement. The attorney general in Texas put out a statement threatening legal action against the Big 12 if they pursue something of not allowing them to play. This is going to be a very messy situation. At the end of the day, though, the Big 12, as it stands, has its right to be able to do this if they feel the need. Obviously, they have to go in there and recognize that there is going to be legal actions, right? There's going to be a fight. With that, though, they can't be bullied by a legal suit. If not, Brett Yormark is in a world of hurt because he's just shown that he can't take control of the Big 12, and it becomes the laughing stock of the country. It's already fighting an uphill battle of trying to fight against the Big 10 and the SEC in terms of trying to find some foothold in college athletics. If you acquiesce to what Texas Tech is doing and just not even blink an eye, this absolutely puts everybody in harm's way. That includes BYU, that includes Utah, that includes all the members of the Big 12 conference. Yes, the court order has said that there's an injunction to allow Brendan Sorsby to play, but these member institutions don't have to do it. Even if it, I don't know what their recourse will be regardless of this, but at the same time, if the Big 12 does not act, this puts them in a very precarious situation moving forward. You already have other conferences that are threatening not to play Texas Tech in every sport. The Big 10 today came out and said they won't create a conference mandate, but they're not going to restrict a team by team or a school by school mandate. So if Ohio State wants to say we're not going to play Texas Tech, the Big 10 isn't going to, disallow that, right? This is going to be a team's issue. And you're going to see that probably throughout the rest of the country, that if the universities themselves want to create a sanction against that school, that's okay. The difference here in the Big 12 is that this becomes a conference issue. You have conference games. Texas Tech is scheduled with 9 opponents in conference. You can't just you can't ignore this, right? So this becomes a situation now where the Big 12 has to act. And if they miss this, it is going to be large. There's already been a significant, pushback against Texas Tech in the national media, against the schools and everything. If the Big 12 doesn't act, this becomes a major issue for the Big 12 and its member institutions. And at that point, you're going to have very many institutions, barring them being unanimous in their decision and saying we're not going to act, there's going to be some situations where they look to potentially get out. Now, look, many of these schools are already looking to their future and trying to build to whatever that Power 2 structure is going to be most likely, right? Texas Tech is actually included in one of those. And the fact that they're doing this and going so hard for one season, for one player, may actually hurt their chances in a lot of respects, right? This is something that is going to have large ramifications on the future of college athletics in many situations, and yet they're still standing by for one player. And I understand it. There's the conversation that, oh, you're part of the family, we got to support you. You can support somebody and make them a member of your family and support them in whatever they need, especially in addiction recovery, but that doesn't mean that you should play them. The narrative out there from Texas Tech is, well, this isn't like he's out there killing somebody or beating up somebody or doing something. Like, we're totally missing the point here when we're doing that kind of stuff. And it's it's a gaslighting type mentality where it's like, well, we're going to condone one thing where we don't. And why are you guys looking at us like we're the problem? You are the problem. You're not recognizing faults. You're not recognizing the things that need to happen. And now you're putting the entire conference as a whole in jeopardy of a massive problem, right? So this isn't just a Texas Tech issue. This is a Utah issue. This is a BYU issue. This is every team in this conference's issue. And if they continue and they vote to allow them to be able to play or to not have any repercussions, the groundswell of attention is going to be massive. It's already massive and it's going to get worse. So this is where the Big 12 has to act. And I understand this doesn't impact you on a day-to-day basis. And at the end of the day, you probably don't even care. But this is going to have some major implications for the Big 12 and what it's going to be. The Big 12 Media Days in about a month is going to be a zoo, especially if Brendan Sorsby shows up. They would be crazy, but knowing kind of the how Texas Tech has approached this, I guarantee you Brendan Sorsby is going to be there at Big 12 Media Days, assuming that this all plays out this way. So we'll see. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Honestly, it's kind of annoying that we have to get down this road because should be something that is pretty easy to identify and say, hey, this is wrong. And yet here we are. Look, I understand that there's other things about, in the NFL or in other programs where we're condoning sexual assault and we're condoning other things. Like all of those are wrong. Nobody is saying that those things are right. But in this situation, this is a major one that needs to be, fixed before it just blows up more than it already has. So that's it. Barring some other major news from this, my hope is that we're done with this conversation. It won't be the end because there's going to be some news probably next week, but we'll see. As it relates to that, next week I'll probably only be doing one episode and combining the two teams together. I've got some meetings at work that are going to take all day long, and I just don't think I'm going to be able to get two podcasts out next week. We'll see. Maybe get lucky. Maybe I'll get lucky. We'll see. There's that. So let's transition to something a little bit more Utah specific now that we're, 12 minutes into this podcast. So let's jump into Utah's official visitors for June 12th. So this weekend, there's going to be 9 athletes that are going to be joining, at least 9 athletes. It's always, sometimes things happen last minute and things change. So there are several top players coming into here. This is more, I wouldn't even call it Utah heavy. There are more Utah athletes in this recruiting trip, but there's still more out of the state that are, well, I guess it's 4 of 9. Yeah, whatever it is. So the 4 local athletes is led by one Bodie Sparrow, the Davis High safety, who is, being viewed as the top recruit from the state of Utah. Really solid recruit. Sorry, really solid recruit. I was trying to say aspect. That didn't work. Really solid recruit. He's a pretty heavy Oklahoma lean. Many have him as already kind of leaning that way. But this is Utah's chance to be able to say, hey, here's what we've got. He's been up here for many times to be able to do unofficial visits. He's got many people that he's close to up there. This is not a, uninformed visitor. It's more just now the official time to be able to put that out there. So, Utah has a long ways to go. He comes from a Utah family, so this isn't like it's a tough sell in that regard, but there is a big push from Oklahoma to be able to get him. And right now that Oklahoma push is winning. So, Utah's got a long ways to move to get there, but this is going to be their official opportunity to be able to do that and give him kind of their sales pitch to be able to see what they can do to get him. 4-star athlete, really solid player that is going to, do well at the collegiate level. But right now he's an Oklahoma lean. And so this becomes a pivotal weekend to be able to try to change that narrative and help, bring him into the fold, so to speak. Another Utah players that are out there, Uhila Wolfgram, defensive end from Maple Mountain. He's also an Oklahoma lean. We'll see what happens there. Solid player, but another player that is already kind of expected to maybe go toward Oklahoma. Oklahoma has had a large push. Plus, there's other athletes from the state of Utah who have committed to Oklahoma that are kind of part of these 7-on-7 groups that they all played together forever. They're all connected. Many of them, want to continue that at another school. So that's why there's so many of these Oklahoma leans. That's part of what that is. 2 other players from the state of Utah is Christian Henshaw, tight end from American Fork, and then Diesel Dart, the safety from Corner Canyon, obviously the younger brother of Jackson Dart, who is in the NFL right now. So that's rounding out the Utah players. Beyond that, you've got a couple other players that are intriguing that, Utah is high on. You got Rashawn Lavatai, an offensive tackle from, I'm trying to remember now, all of a sudden, I didn't write that one down, but 4-star offensive tackle, another offensive lineman that they want to add to that. Utah's going heavy into this offensive line this season to try to beef up that line and kind of provide that consistency moving forward. A couple other players, Jaden Bibbs, a corner, Taylon Patterson, an athlete, Carvel Wafer, a running back. They're pretty optimistic about that one. We'll see what happens there. And then Jonah Lubno as another quarterback. So just trying to figure out what's going on there and seeing what's happening. but they're trying to load up on this offensive line, trying to keep in-state recruiting well. That's why you've got 4 of these athletes here. It's going to be a busy weekend, but I'm curious to see like how it all shapes up and where it is. Many of these players have potentially their eyes elsewhere. And so this is going to be an interesting weekend to see how Utah does to be able to convince or sell themselves to these players and maybe potentially get them to quote unquote flip, though many of them haven't even committed to a school. So, it's going to be a busy weekend and something that is going to be of interest, and we'll keep you up to date on that stuff. It's official visit season. There isn't a ton to do with that, but we'll see what happens there. So let's transition to our next portion, the last portion of the episode, the meat and the potatoes, so to speak. And that's continuing our series of previewing all of the Utah opponents this season. On Tuesday, we previewed Houston. Houston is definitely not even a dark horse. They are a favorite to win a Big 12 title. Not a favorite, but one of the favorites, I'll say, right? They're number 4 in many predictive models. It goes Texas Tech, BYU, Utah, and then generally Houston. There are some that maybe have Arizona, Kansas State, whatever in there. But Houston is being considered a team that is very favorable to potentially win the Big 12. They've got a lot of holdover from last year. They're a team that's building and growing. So I think there's going to be a lot of success there. So if you didn't listen to that episode, go back and listen to that. We'll preview that. That starts the second half of the schedule. So Utah had already done 6 games. Houston begins the 7th, the back half of the schedule, which is more challenging. And that's, you get that. So this next stretch where you have Houston, Cincinnati, BYU, and the rest of the teams becomes probably the most difficult stretch of their schedule. So, will be really fascinating to see how this goes. On the screen, if you're watching on YouTube, I put this up every single week. It's the Big 12 odds. This is more just an idea of kind of how it's viewed for these teams and how they're expected to win. Texas Tech is now back on the board with 10.5 wins for the season. That's kind of their expectation to lead the conference. BYU and Utah at second with 8.5. And for Cincinnati, they're all the way down at 5.5. So potentially a bowl game for them at 6-6 this season. But they're not expected to necessarily compete at the top, but they're not expected to be the worst either. It's just a team that, has to rebuild to some extent. And, it's unknown what this team is going to be. So let's jump into that. Cincinnati, this game is game 8. It's the road game for Utah where they have to play on Halloween, October 31st. They'll be at Nippert Stadium in Cincinnati, Ohio. So you're going to get another road game for Utah that way. Cincinnati finished the season last year with a 7-6 record, 5-4 in Big 12 play. This is a team that so Cincinnati comes into this game having played Texas Tech the week before. So tough opponent. We'll see what happens. They do get them at home, so Cincinnati gets back-to-back home games, but they have Texas Tech, Utah, and then after this game, they get Houston. So it's a tough stretch for them as well. Are you beat up? Where are you at that? Is Utah beat up? This is a difficult stretch for all of these teams right here, and this is kind of the meat of those schedules. Texas Tech last year was a very solid team. They lost their season opener to Nebraska, but then went on to win, I think it was 7 straight games. I have the note. There it is. Yeah, 7 straight games. And, was doing really well, was expected to be a Big 12, contender for the championship game, and then met up with Utah. And Utah absolutely blew the doors off of Cincinnati. They won 45-14. They made Brendan Sorsby look average. I mean, he still produced at times, but they put some pressure on him, and he does not do well under pressure, and they absolutely made his life hell. And as a result of that, Rice-Eccles Stadium was rocking. It was a 45-14 win, and Cincinnati goes on to lose their first conference game of the season. Well, that so happened to be the first game of a 5-game losing streak. They didn't win another game after losing that game to Utah the rest of the season. So really kind of took the wind under their sails way and really hurt them. And, obviously the rest is history. Brendan Sorsby transfers to Texas Tech and, all that. Now, as part of this, reportedly, Cincinnati knew about his gambling as well. So let's not pretend like Cincinnati's innocent here. They're just the ones taking, the low road here and keeping their head out. That's the greatest PR that you can do in this situation. Is just ignore it. And, if there's fallback later, there's fallback later. But as it stands, Cincinnati is slipping under the radar and enjoying life that way. There is rumors that Cincinnati was the one that leaked it. They were upset after their lawsuit was going a little south with Brendan Sorsby that they're the ones that leaked it. So believe what you want, but that has nothing to do with football, and we're talking football. So let's jump into that. So like I said, 5.5 wins this season is their projection. Phil still has them tied 7th with 4 other teams. He usually lists most of the teams, but then when there's a group that he doesn't really have any identifier of, like, he'll still kind of rank them, but he puts them all in a spot of, you're in this group. And so there's 4 teams that Cincinnati's tied with in that 7th spot. Arizona State, Kansas State, or they're tied with 4 other teams. Sorry, there's 5 teams. Arizona State, Kansas State, UCF, and West Virginia. So smack dab in the middle of the conference is kind of where he sees it. That's aligned with, those betting odds that I showed you. That's aligned with many of what they're thinking. So we'll see what happens there. Cincinnati last year was an incredibly efficient team on offense. They were one of the most efficient teams even throughout the duration of the season. So it wasn't like this was a team that wasn't efficient. I think Utah was one of the only least efficient, and even then they still had some good efficiency. They just couldn't score. But for the most part was efficient all season behind an offensive line that was veteran, really solid unit, and they did well with it. The problem is their defense struggled late, especially. It wasn't poor by any means, but at the same time, it wasn't great and lost them a lot of games. Turnovers and some other things did that as well late in the season. But that defense kind of regressing really hurt. Especially poor was their pass rush. They weren't able to get in the backfield. It was honestly one of the worst in FBS, according to PFF. Just wasn't able to get it done. And so you really weren't putting a ton of pressure, which allowed teams to be able to move the ball really well on you. And it became, a shooting match essentially to be able to try to have the most points at the end of the game. So it was tough for Cincinnati. So much progress, so much expectations for the season, especially with the veteran unit. And then it just kind of crumbled after that Utah game. So that's, what happened. Now, as the season relates, because of kind of what had happened, Scott Satterfield, the head coach, made big changes in his coaching staff. So what he did is he replaced Brad Glenn, who was their offensive coordinator. He was let go. He's now since with Clemson, but he promoted 2 guys into a co-offensive coordinator position. And so that's Pete Thomas, their quarterback coach, and Nick Cardwell, the O-line coach. And so you've got 2 experienced guys. The difference here, though, is that neither one of them have been an offensive coordinator and are guys that are up and coming. So there's not a lot of familiarity with just actual play calling. That's not to say that they can't be effective in what they do. It's just this is going to be their first stint as offensive coordinator. So, we'll see what happens. I'm going to assume that Nick Cardwell is more of like the run game coordinator. Pete Thomas is a little bit more of everything else there, but we'll see. Both of them are experienced in their own respective realms and are really solid in what they do, but we don't really know what it's going to look like as an offensive coordinator role, like the 2 of them together. Now, with that said, by game 8, Utah's going to have a very familiar plan of who Cincinnati is. They're not going to come catch them sleeping. This is going to be something that by it's going to be 8 weeks into this before you play this game where you're going to have tape on Cincinnati. It's not going to be a surprise. And so that element of it is not going to be a problem. You're going to know if the 2 offensive coordinators are doing well or they're doing poorly. You'll scheme toward it, whatever. So whatever that issue is, whether, they're effective or not, is kind of a moot point because you're going to have the tape on it. And so it doesn't matter. How it's expected to run based on kind of spring and kind of the expectations from both of these coaches is it should be an RPO based system that is reliant heavily on its dual threat QB. Not really a shocker in an RPO system, but they really want to hone in on that and do that. There's a heavy emphasis on trench play, trying to be the most physical in there and trying to mix it up. You saw that last year with their offensive line and be able to work that way. But it's, there's going to be some elements there. They also want to establish that downhill run game. They want to be a heavy emphasis on run, but to mix that in, similar to what you saw last year with Brendan Sorsby, is they want to be explosive over the top. There's not going to be a lot of like short passes. That's not to say that there couldn't be some, but they really want to emphasize the deep shots. And so it's going to be a high risk, high reward type offense where you try to hope that your physicality up front will dominate. You'll be able to create that separation, either one, to allow the run game to be effective and have talented running backs to be able to do the job, or two, you're just going to blow the top off the field and just take deep shots. And in Utah's system where they're much more man based, that's not to say that they don't shift into zone coverages at times. There is potential where you can get beat if any one of those corners aren't doing their job. So, that's the biggest concern for Utah, assuming that Utah's doing better in the run defense. If that run defense isn't working and they're not physical up front, yeah, there's problems, right? And this game could spell trouble, especially on the road. And suddenly, you're giving up a ton in the run, and then so you shift up into the box a little bit to try to stop that, and that's when your quarterback comes over the top and absolutely blows the doors off. So, this has potential to be dangerous, assuming one, that Cincinnati can be effective in what they do, and two, that Utah isn't sound in their defense, right? So we'll see what happens. Like I said, we'll know both teams very well at this point, but this is kind of the expectation. RPO based, want to be a downhill run team, and then take those deep shots down the field through, play action passes, that kind of stuff. So we'll see what happens there. Defensive side of the ball, they bring in Nate Woody from Army, who has been there for 6 years. Really solid defensive coordinator. Led Army to phenomenal defensive runs. Top of the league in many categories of that defensive mindset, and so there is a strong pedigree of being able to be effective there. He also coached with Scott Satterfield at App State. From I think it was 2013 to 2017. So there was a long stretch there. They have familiarity with each other and are solid. What Nate Woody does is he's very aggressive in how he approaches it. So what he has in the system, it's kind of defined as a positionless 3-4 system. So there's a lot of shifts and there's a lot of different things that they can do with it, but that's kind of what their base off our defense is. So you have some players where you'll be in that 3-4, but you may have a linebacker that ends up lining up as a D end or whatever have you. So that's kind of their base model. But there are some systems in here where he expects these players to understand everything situationally. Maybe similar to what Morgan Scalley is trying to do, but I think a little bit different. But he wants them to be very situationally aware. As part of that, he has what he calls the hawk call. If he's in there and he's always mixing in and out of his calls. So he's always trying to get them to understand what there is. So you're always constantly watching, always constantly changing. You're never getting a feel for what he does because he's constantly moving. As part of that hawk call, if one of the players on the field calls the hawk call, that essentially takes him out as the DC, and every player is essentially allowed to do what they feel that they need to be able to be effective. That sounds chaotic. It's not quite that chaotic, but it's something where they feel like, okay, this is the time where we can kind of be free and do what we need to and just play ball. I don't know how often you're going to see that, but there are potentials where that happens where, he gives them the flexibility and the freedom depending on the looks that they see on the field. Maybe they hear different, call outs or whatever it may be, and they feel like, okay, this is what we can do. And somebody on the D line calls the hot call or whatever it is. At that point, like I said, the players are in charge and they take control. So curious to see what happens there. He prioritizes up front guys that are more quick than size. And so he wants guys that are going to speed, rush. He wants guys to slip the gap quickly. He's not looking for guys that are going to mix it up in the line with physical bodies. That's not to say that they won't be big, but he wants guys that are going to shoot the gap, be quick, be aggressive, especially off the edges, and get into that backfield. So you're going to have a lot of aggressive style up front, especially where you're going to have guys that are going to try to do whatever they can to, get there quickly instead of try to maybe out physical you. And as part of that, though, is he usually lines up his defensive ends inside the tackles. Usually you have them outside so they can kind of get the edge and whatever. But these with the inside, with his 3-4, design, he wants to be able to clog up that system. So with his speed and everything, he's going to clog up that system and kind of make it feel more of like a 4-3 type situation. There are times where you will shift into that. Obviously, that linebacker will play as like a D end, trying to help there. But there's going to be several twists, there's slants, there's blitzes, there's different things to try to make the offense move quickly. If he's doing his job and his defensive, line, and especially these linebackers are doing their job, they can move quickly and absolutely overwhelm a line. In this situation, if Utah's offensive line is not up to snuff and they're having problems this year, this becomes a real problem or a real concern, right? You come in there, maybe you're reeling from the week before, I don't know. This becomes a problem where you suddenly now have to go up against a team that is going to be very quick and you have to decide. Devin Dampier, assuming that he's healthy, has to be very quick in his judgment. You have to understand how to stay in the pocket. You have to decide how to roll out, when to do all that. They're also going to do a lot of things to try to take that away from you, as maybe that guy that's a line in that 3-4. He's a linebacker and he lines up as a DN, but maybe he shifts back into coverage. There's a lot of different things that are going to come into play that is going to force Utah into, some pressure situations. So that fourth linebacker especially is going to be the one that changes everything. They're the one that's going to be, either down in the dirt, they're going to be in the back in coverage, they're going to be in a lot of different situations that could change things, and that's going to be kind of the situation there. So this is, an interesting team, an interesting defense, and what they're able to do. Really curious, like what is going to take place with this team and how it all comes about. But in theory, defensively, they have a guy that should be able to be effective with this team. He's done it with, a tougher recruiting class because of a military school. If he can do it there, and admittedly it's in a lower league, but if he can do it there, there's potential that you can do it at Cincinnati, especially if you get buy-in, especially if you get guys that can live in that system. This could potentially be a much improved defense. So we'll see. I mean, there's not a lot of expectations on that, but we'll see. Beyond that, the other coaches, he changed 5 position coaches. I'm not going to get into those, but a lot of other position coaches changed. So for the most part, this is an entirely new coaching staff who will be working with each other in their first season. And so it'll be interesting to see how it all gels and comes together. Looking at the transfer portal, in the transfer portal, Cincinnati lost 23 players and they bring in 22. Not a ton, not a little. It's just kind of in the middle of where the Big 12 is. Really just kind of replacing some of the guys and adding some value to what it is. Biggest names outgoing from the transfer portal, obviously Brendan Sorsby, the biggest name there. You lose your starting quarterback, which is never a great thing. You also then lose one of your leading running backs in Evan Pryor. He left to Florida. He had 522 yards last year as their third leading running back. And then you lose 2 of your top receivers, Noah Jennings and Caleb Goody, one to Minnesota, one to Missouri, respectively. They were your second and fifth leading receiver. There's a bunch of other players there. I don't really need to get into that, but, you lose them. Incoming transfers, you have a lot of players that are going to potentially start. And namely, you're going to have a quarterback, you're going to have, running backs, you're going to have wide receivers. That's where the bulk of their transfer portals came in. There are some on the defensive side of the ball, but for the most part, the bulk of your impact players are going to come on the offense. And I'm going to give you kind of that breakdown here and let you know who that is. So starting at quarterback, you lose Brendan Sorsby. Obviously, he goes to Texas Tech and all the fallout there. They bring in Georgia Southern's quarterback and J.C. French the fourth. He's a veteran senior. Has thrown for a ton of yards over the last 2 years. Last year, he threw for just short of 3,000 yards, had 20 touchdowns and 8 interceptions, and completes almost 64% of his passes. He also rushed for 315 yards and 6 touchdowns last year at Georgia Southern. So really solid player, fits that dual threat quarterback model that they want. Not relying on his run too much, but at the same time enough that they feel like that they can do what they need to. So really curious to see what JC French does. I think he's got the potential to be a really solid asset for Cincinnati. He's the projected starter. I can't imagine there being any difference here. They do bring in Liam O'Brien from Penn, but that's an FCS level. And, I'm not, like I said, I don't badmouth FCS players because many of them produce really well at the FBS level, but you also have a proven starter who has done it in the FBS level. So barring JC French just not being able to grasp what, the offensive coordinators want from him and not executing what he needs to at Cincinnati, he's going to be the projected starter going into the season and potentially by game 8. So if it's not JC French, I think Cincinnati is going to be in a world of hurt. I just don't know that they have enough talent behind him to really change any of that. At running back, you lose your leading rusher in Tawi Walker. He had 709 rushing yards last year. You do bring back a redshirt freshman in Zion Johnson who had 106 yards. But after that, you're rebuilding the entire room with transfers. So it's a mixed bag. Zion Johnson has shown potential and can be a really solid asset for Cincinnati. He's just young, so we'll see what happens there. Tab to probably be the lead back right now as it stands is probably Zylan Perry, transfer from Louisiana. Last year, he was their second leading rusher with 689 yards, 8 touchdowns, and averaged about 5 yards per carry. There's also Cole Tab from Stanford. He was their second leading rusher. He had 445 yards and 3 touchdowns and averaged just about 4 per carry. So, maybe it's Zylan Perry as your lead back. You've got Cole Tab and maybe Zion Johnson as your 2-3. And then behind that, you have, Gabrain Payne from Notre Dame. Only had 53 yards last year. He did average 6 yards per carry, but that's so little to know. He's also a senior, so he hasn't had a ton of reps that way. But I think they've got a pretty stocked running back room. They've got some good players that they feel like they can be they can build with. And so you've got a lot of potential there with that downhill run game to be able to be effective. Like I said, whether it's Zylan Perry or Zion Johnson, Cole Tab, one of those 3, I would assume it's Zion Johnson or Zylan Perry that get that spot, but we'll see. So solid players there. Wide receivers, they lost 5 of their top leading receivers. So all 5 leading receivers, they left, 2 to the transfer portal, the rest to graduation. Tough to be able to lose all that. They do hold over Isaiah Johnson, who finished with 222 yards last year. I believe he was their 6th leading receiver. So they do have some holdover from that. But beyond that, they went through to the portal to build, and they did bring in some solid assets there. You got Lorenzo Fenner, sophomore from South Dakota. He finished with 1,000 yards and 15 touchdowns. His average catch was 22.8 yards. Now, FCS level, solid program. You're usually dominating a lot of teams. So, I don't know that he's necessarily a 1,000-yard receiver in the Big 12, but if he is, all the more power to him. And I think that's a great opportunity for Cincinnati. But still, a solid player who has done really well at a lower level. Can he make that happen at Cincinnati? We'll see. They also bring in another FCS player in Malachi Henry from Central Arkansas. He finished with 889 yards and 10 touchdowns, averaged about 13 yards per catch. Another solid player from the FCS ranks. Both players, should be tabbed as starter caliber, depending on how they translate to it and kind of what happens there. They also bring in Cade Wolford from Kent State, a sophomore. He had 509 yards and 7 touchdowns last year. His was crazy. He averaged 27 yards per catch. So he's that deep threat guy. That fits Cincinnati so well that if Cade Wolford gets down the field and he's the guy that they need and he can do it at the Big 12 level, clearly he's shown, some potency there and some danger. So, expect him to kind of be in there. And then another player to be factoring in there is JV Gibson, a senior from Oklahoma. He finished with 200 yards last year and 1 touchdown. So that should round out, your top 5 receivers. We'll see what happens in fall, but they've got a good group of players that should be pretty solid for them. The offensive line, they didn't bring any from the portal. They're building in from their class. So you've got players that will have, some experience and some consistency, and others that have been depth players that are moving in and taking over. I don't believe all of that is fully set, but they do have, I don't even know how to say his last name, Evan Tangzadal. He's expected to be an All-American type player, really solid player, 735 snaps, was the 2nd leading player on Cincinnati in Pro Football Focus grades. His run block grades were an 89.7, incredible grades there. He's kind of going to be the engine to that offensive line and the most or has the most experience there to be able to help them. So, he'll be paired up on the left side with Joe Cotton at left tackle, 771 snaps. Should be a pretty good side of the offensive line. The rest of the unit, we'll see. I know there's been some conversations about who will start at center, maybe shifting over Taron Tayo into center. He's usually played right guard. There's conversations there on what they do there, but for the most part, not quite the same veteran unit that they had last year, but a good base of consistency there, especially with a couple holdovers that should serve them well. So offensively, yes, they have to hit on some of these players, but at the same time, they have the means to be able to be a similarly efficient team moving forward. But there's a lot that has to go there. You've got a new offensive coordinator or new offensive coordinators who have never done this before. You've got all new transfers in basically the running back room, wide receiver room. Your offensive line is pretty solid. You have a new transfer quarterback who in theory should be pretty solid, but there's a lot of questions there as it relates to the offense on everything hitting, right? We'll see what happens there. What's there defensively. Jonathan Thompson, excuse me, at linebacker is probably the star of the class there. He'll be the one that is the one that gets the focal point and the guy that is expected to do well. Solid players all around, but none that I really can shout out right now in terms of, hey, pay attention to this guy. That's not to diminish anybody there. That's not to say that they don't have any players that are going to be effective. But I think it's just, there's a lot of turnover there. But I guarantee you with the players that they've brought in and with the new defensive coordinator, they're going to be very aggressive in what they do. Now, that can bite them in the butt, right? You can be a little too aggressive and things don't work for you, especially if Utah's efficient or other teams are efficient. But we'll see. I think the 3-4 defense is going to be an interesting look and something that, has been proven at Army, but we'll see if that can translate to the Big 12. And I'm not saying it can't, but we'll see. So to me, the biggest questions really come down to just the amount of transfer players coming in. You've got new offensive coordinators who have never done that before, but have experience and have been effective in what they have done in their own realms. You've got a defensive coordinator that's coming in new, moving up from Army, who's been effective and done what he needs to. But, you're doing it with a different program, new players. Can that defense actually be effective this year as opposed to last year where they regressed? So to me, there's not like wholesale questions that are massive, but it's just a lot of minor ones that build up to the whole. And there's a large there's a large gap in terms of consistency there. And so we'll see. There's not a lot of holdover, especially on the offensive side of the ball. You're doing that with new offensive coordinators. I think that's just too much to ask initially from the beginning. Doesn't mean that they can't be effective. I really think this team is built to be able to be effective, but there's just so much newness on that side of the ball that I think it's going to be tough to get consistency. Many players need, generally speaking, at least a year to get into a system to understand it. That's not to say that this will be that case, but we'll see what happens there. So that's it for today. That's Cincinnati. We'll be shifting on, moving forward with the next week's. It's going to be an interesting situation as this all transpires with Texas Tech. How does that shape this landscape of the conference? If not, there's potential, assuming that everything has gone well for Utah up until this point in Cincinnati. You have that meeting with BYU, and assuming that everything's gone well with them, if Texas Tech is not included in that, that becomes a very pivotal game, not just for the rivalry, but for actual Big 12, maybe playoffs, maybe for the Big 12 championship. That game becomes, high stakes, as it always is. But I think that one's going to be interesting. So next week, we'll focus on Utah's next two opponents, game 9 and 10, getting closer to the end of the season, which means we're getting closer to Big 12 Media Days and the unofficial start of football. So with that, we're going to sign out. I appreciate you all for listening, and I hope you have a great day.